Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I am John Agroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Now, I understand, as a commenter has literally said to me, that I don't look like I've been doing anything for professionally for 5 years, let alone 10. Specifically, somebody was like, "It's so interesting that you're in your 20s and you've already been doing this for 10 years." I am very sorry to inform that commenter and maybe remind many of you who have already probably guessed, I am in my 30s. And I'm well into my 30s, as it turns out. But being Puerto Rican means that I guess I look a little bit younger. I get it from my parents. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about prologues again. And I understand we already did a whole episode about prologues 2 months ago. And I actually just re listened to that episode because I wanted to get a refresher on what did I mention? What did we talk about? And it was a great episode. You can definitely check it out. I think that it was probably helpful in terms of establishing, I think, like the overall conversation around prologues, why a lot of people are resistant to them, a lot of the common pitfalls, but then also how prologues can work, can be done effectively depending on your skill level and experience and credibility as a writer. Specifically, I remember talking about how I think that a lot of the time the people who get away with prologues tend to get away with them because maybe their audience is willing to give them, like, cut them some slack. They're like, I don't usually write prologues, or read prologues, I should say, but this author wrote one and I know I like this author, so I'm going to I'll be fine with that. But when you're like a new author and you are trying to bring people into your work and build an audience, people see prologues and something clicks in their brains of like, this isn't actually important to the story. There's like an assumption that is made, either fairly or unfairly, right? It really comes down to the times and current habits of current readers. And that just tends to be something, I think, born out of how a lot of prologues aren't done very well. I've read a lot of books that have been traditionally published, and prologues can be very frustrating in these stories because they don't feel like they're totally figured out. Now, we already did, again, a whole prologues episode. It was called When Prologues Work and When They Don't. I wanted to do something different, though, and put some of the prologue stuff into practice through a critique. So specifically looking at a prologue that somebody has provided and giving them some feedback. And I decided with this one, I'm going to be harsh. I'm actually going to be harsh because I think that, or I'm going to try to be harsh. I haven't read the prologue yet. It might be amazing. But producer Natalia Emmons has assured me that I have an opportunity here because Natalia read this ahead of time, that based on what she knows about me and my critique style, that I have an opportunity here to maybe be a little bit more prescriptive than I normally would be. And I should actually get this out of the way. I think it's really important to remember that I am going to be critiquing this from the standpoint of an editor. This isn't how I would critique somebody if I was beta reading. If I'm beta reading, well, first of all, it depends on the person and how well I know them. Typically, I'm going to give them emotional feedback, vibe checks, things like that. I'm not really going to rip their stuff apart because it's really discouraging and they didn't ask me for that, right? I think that what people look for in beta readers, or what I think they should be looking for, and I think Brandon Sanderson literally just mentioned this. He has a new lecture series out, I think this past week. I already listened to it, but I think he talks about this too. I remember he says that you're really trying to just, as a beta reader, help people observe how a story is working on its audience. Critique partners and editors are the ones who should do what I'm about to do, which is be a little bit harsher, but constructively. And I say this as somebody who, I'm not just an editor, but as a film critic. I live and breathe critique. I judge, and I am very self-righteous. Unfortunately, it is a curse, but I have to monetize it some way, right? And in this case, I'm not monetizing it. I'm giving it for free. And the reason is because I think that prologues are under such amazing scrutiny these days. And so I feel the need to really show you the how and why most prologues, especially from new authors, tend to be a bad idea, even though they can be done very well. And again, in that episode that we already did, I gave examples of great prologues. And the thing that I do want to remind everybody too is that prologues, think of them again as cold opens to movies that you like. There's a video on YouTube, I forget the YouTuber, but I think they compared two cold opens side by side. I know I mentioned The Dark Knight as a good example, but the cold open in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark specifically, great prologue because it's a mini story, right? You can watch the cold open to Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it is just thrilling and wonderful to watch on its own, right? It does inform the rest of the story. There are important things that happen in the prologue that establish the entire movie. However, you can still just watch it and it's fun. You don't feel like it's all set up and no payoff, which usually the weaker prologues tend to be that, just set up in the sense that, well, then why isn't this chapter one? Oh, it's because it's a different perspective character. Then why should I care about them? And so on, so on, and so on. And then a bad example of a prologue or cold open in a film would be the 2017 Justice League, where we had that really awkward moment where you see Henry Cavill playing Superman and he's answering a couple of questions that kids are asking him on a webcam. That is an example of like, that's not fun to watch. It is not really a scene. It's just sort of this studio note of people think that Superman's too depressing because Batman v Superman established that. So we kind of need to, from the outset, be like, actually, no, this Superman is a symbol of hope. These kids will love him. And people watched that in the theater, myself included, and we didn't buy it at all. So that can happen in novels where your novel is trying to perform a function that goes beyond helping the reader and instead trying to convince the reader of something that you maybe feel insecure about. I don't know. There are all kinds of reasons why prologues tend to not work, but let's actually look at one. Let's critique one step by step. And if you are listening to this through the audio only version of the podcast, I am doing this one since it is a critique as a video. So if you'd like to watch the video of this, if you're not already, you can find us on the YouTube channel, and it's just under my YouTube, John Negroni, and you can see and read along with us. But of course, I'll link to the prompt as well. So this comes to us in the Fantasy Writers subreddit, and Talia already put it in a Google Doc for me. So nice, made it so easy for me. And this one, I'm going to bring up on the screen now so you can see it. There we go. Okay. All right. So username Naive Historian 2110. So they write, I made a prologue ages ago for this story, but it was basically just an omniscient lore dump, and on the nose telling of an event in my world called the Martyr of Mothers. I like that. I like that. Just construction, Martyr of Mothers. Though a bit cliche, I retooled some of it into this newer prologue that reads in a typical, quote, parent telling a story, end quote, trope. But as always, the effectiveness of cliche and tropes in a story are dependent on execution. Just as a reminder, we did a whole episode about this. Cliche and trope are not interchangeable. Cliche, the thing to remember is cliche is a trope gone wrong. It's a trope not done well. But tropes are always going to be in your story, right? And I think the spirit of what they're saying here, yes, correct. I kept it short and sweet because I don't want the reader to over-invest in the prologue, as none of the characters are in the main story. Real quick on that, I think you don't have to worry about that too much. I think that folks typically see prologue and make that assumption already because it's not the chapter one. That said, yeah, it's tricky to be like, I don't want you to overinvest in the prologue, but I'm also putting the prologue in this book, and I'm putting it in your way to the meat of the story. Why are you doing that? Right? That's the first question I would ask if I was the like professionally editing this story, right? So they go on to say, though my book could work without a prologue, then take it out, I really wanted to set some of the tone for my story with this important info. You can set the tone in chapter one, and you should, because both of the MCs in my story have mothers that died in the event, which means that in this prologue, if mothers are dying in the prologue, that's going to undercut that happening again later in the story, if that's the case. They say, so I'd love some insight into whether this could work or if I should just scrap it from the story and start with chapter one. And as always, thanks for reading. Okay, so that gives me the impetus to answer their question and let them know if I agree or disagree with the sentiment that, you know, this should be in their story. And I'll say at the outset, if you feel like, if you have this much doubt and you're feeling like, I don't know, that's a sign. That's a sign that you probably don't need it. Because if you don't feel that strongly about it, then why would you put it here? That's the thing. So we're not going to look at the chapter one. They haven't provided that. And I think Natalia has a note for me here. It's 420 words, and this is a dark fantasy. Okay, so that's good to know. All right, so let's read this, starting with the first line here. It's just wine, sissy, said the girl to her younger sister. Everyone knows it isn't real blood. Hush now. Their mother held a finger to her lips, her other hand cupping the shoulder of her eldest daughter. The blood may be fake, but their sacrifice was real. Below them, a procession of women in white walked the streets, smeared head to toe with red pastes. Their arms extended outward, and across their palms lay silver swords that held no use beyond the ritual. From their perch above the square, the young girl watched, her eyes fixed on the crimson stains as smoky incense wafted upward, tickling her throat. Achoo! It was a loud sneeze for a girl her size, cutting harshly through the soft bells of the procession. And in its aftermath, the lively crowd froze. The women in white halted mid step, their heads turning upward to find the source of the sound. The girl made herself small, shrinking behind her mother's skirt. One by one, the women in white turned and bowed, their silver swords glinting through the haze. "Why are they looking at me?" she whispered, clutching onto her mother. Her mother knelt beside her, smoothing out the girl's hair with a tender smile. "A sneeze during the ritual is a good omen, love. It means the mothers are watching over you." The girl's face brightened at the thought, her cheeks red with a bashful pride. "I can sneeze too," the older sister declared, scrunching up her face and letting out a weak cough. But it was barely audible over the murmur of the crowd, and not a single head turned. The young girl giggled as her sister huffed in disappointment, arms crossed. "That was no sneeze," their mother teased, straightening up and pulling them close. "The mothers know when it's real." As the procession continued its solemn march, the younger girl couldn't help but beam, her heart warmed by the idea of the mothers watching over her. "Mother," said the girl, older girl, "if the mothers are dead, how can they be watching?" The words brought a sourness to the faces of those around them, and her scowling mother grabbed her by the ear. "Did you see their swords?" she muttered scoldingly, twisting her daughter's face to meet hers. "They live on their swords, and as nurturing as they are, they can be just as harsh." The eldest daughter didn't say another word, but neither did her sister. Instead, she wondered, unsure if the mother's gaze was a gift or a curse. Okay, that is the that is the prologue. Now, I remember in that episode we talked about one of the things I mentioned was that you don't necessarily need, like, if it's fewer than 500 words. In fact, I think producer Bridget said this. If it's fewer than 500 words, that is going to make the reader question even more whether or not you need the prologue itself. It just will. So keep that in mind. Let's do a compliment sandwich, right? I'm not going to go right off the bat. Let me say what's working here. We have decent prose. We don't have super impressive prose. We have readable prose in the sense that it's close enough to publishable, essentially. You are getting the pacing just about right. You are using decent word choice. You're not repeating things too much. I can read this and understand basically what you're trying to say for the most part. It's not necessarily elevated, and I'm not reading it feeling deep emotions. However, I am able to just kind of read it and get the picture in my head close enough. Now, there are, of course, a few missing ingredients to that, but it's not necessarily the end all be all because, again, you say that you're trying to set a tone. My question is, what is that tone? I genuinely do not know. And I'm gonna have to think about this. I want to maybe distill this down. And I told you all I'm gonna be a little bit harsh here. So, but I don't want to be mean. There's a difference. First up, we have a little bit of genre confusion here. I think that this scene, and I struggle to call it a scene, it doesn't feel like a scene, but what this is does feel like it's attempting to mix a sort of ritualistic mysticism, right? With all the, stuff going on with the mother martyrs thing. It's trying to mix all the ritualistic stuff with a tender family dynamic. But the tone is all over the place. Now, here's the thing. If you want to combine those two things, that can absolutely work. And it's an opportunity because you don't usually think of rituals and this kind of like, ooh, what's going on with, this nice little family thing going on. And so what you're attempting to do, I think is interesting and smart. And it has a lot of room for hooking the reader. The problem is, like I said, the tone doesn't match these two things. The tone is leaning heavy into the tender family dynamic without acknowledging the ritualistic stuff. And so I, as the reader, I don't follow what you're trying to say. I can read what you're saying and I can understand what you're trying to say with the tender family dynamic, but I generally don't see what tone you are ultimately trying to grab out of these two contrasting things that don't usually go together, right? So I'm not saying that it has to be one or the other. However, there has to be through the story an acknowledgement of these two things not going together and how that might be unsettling, right? I think what's her name? The author of the Lottery, Shirley Jackson. Forgetting her name. Prolific author. I feel terrible, but that was kind of her deal, right? The Lottery is a very, very dark story, and for research purposes, take a look at how Shirley author last name, was able to do that because I think that it's a masterclass. But again, I just think that it's hard to discern, like, are we in like a solemn, myth laden kind of setting where this ritual holds like real power? Or are we really in just kind of like a slice of life moment between these siblings and there's just kind of a spooky backdrop, right? I think the genre commitment isn't clear enough to me. It just isn't. If this is supposed to be something major, like a global sort of story event that is going to not even move the plot forward, but inform the plot that's about to happen, the problem is that you've established something a bit too static. Right? I don't have a reveal of any worldview. And if anything, I think it's too on the nose in terms of what's happening. I'm not getting subtext. I'm not getting a lot of complicated dynamics here. It's just a little bit too straightforward based on what you're setting up here. And speaking of that, the second thing, the stakes. The stakes are barely there. I genuinely reading this, I don't understand what's at stake, and that's a huge issue here. Now, that doesn't mean the big stakes for your novel have to be established here because it is a prologue. However, what is at stake for the characters in this situation? All we get is that a sneeze disrupts a ritual. The girl kind of feels proud but bashful at the same time. Okay. And then meanwhile, her sister is kind of jealous. She tries to replicate the sneeze. The stakes here, they're non-existent, practically speaking. We're told that there's something kind of ominous maybe about the mothers. It's treated in a way that maybe should feel ominous, but then the tension, if there was any, it dissolves into this kind of mild family squabbling, basically, where the mother is talking down to the kids and trying to wrangle them. And to me, I'm asking, where's the sense of danger, right? Where's the consequence of what's happening? What happens, right, if the girl's sneeze wasn't an omen? Or if the older sister's dismissal of the ritual, is that going to spark something darker? I don't know, because the stakes, they need to be, we need an upgrade to the stakes in order to make the reader care about what's actually happening on the page. But because that's not being established at all, I just come away from this being like, why did I read that? What did I get out of this? What happened to these characters? Because I want to care about the characters, but I'm not given that reason. Okay, so then the third thing I would say is I always want to find a turning point, right? In this kind of, like, if you have a prologue, I know we've talked about with a 6-act story structure, turning points are key to making sure that your novel is constantly moving and ascending, right? And if your prologue is a bit of a short story where you have a beginning, middle, end, that means you should have a turning point. And to that end, every scene needs a turning point. I know I say this all the time and I will never stop saying it. Don't fixate on prologues and chapters and acts. It's scenes. I know I'm borrowing a bit from the StoryGrid folks. StoryGrid's a YouTube channel and a whole service thing. Sean Coyne specifically, he's all about this kind of stuff. I fully have always, since I was in high school and I had a wonderful teacher who taught me about this, which is that scenes make a story. If you can write a great scene, you can write a great novel. And prologues should be essentially just one scene, right? And every scene needs a turning point. And what is a turning point? A turning point is a moment in the scene where the values shift significantly, right? The value of what's happening and what's going to happen. So, for example, what's at shift in this scene? Because at first glance, I mean, the younger girl, she seems to go from a bit anxious to a bit proud. But that kind of emotional shift, if you can even call it that, that's not enough to carry the weight of a full scene. I told you all I was going to be harsh. The older sister, then, she has this question, right, about the dead mothers, and it comes a little bit too late in this scene, and then it just fizzles out, and without, like I was saying before, without any consequences. So then the final question, like, whether the mother's gaze is a gift or a curse or whatever it is, to me it feels tacked on. It doesn't feel earned, right? A stronger turning point would, I think, involve the ritual going awry, right? That is a turning point. Something goes wrong with the ritual, and then the crowd reacting more dangerously, and then the mother's presence becoming undeniably real, and then we get that consequence. Because all we really get is that moment where the crowd is like, hey, what the heck? And then the mother has this kind of like scolding, like she has a scowl, and you say she mutters something scoldingly, which I didn't love that phrasing. That was like one of the only moments where I think the prose was kind of not working for me at all. But at that point, I'm like, well, then what's going to happen? And then nothing happens. So that is probably the biggest thing of all the stuff I'm going to talk about. I think the lack of the turning point is the biggest issue with this prologue. Next up, I would say exposition. It's just a bit clunky. It's not the worst. I just think that some of the dialogue, there's too much exposition in all of the dialogue. There wasn't enough, I think, dialogue that really added to the tone and the character dynamics. It was just so much exposition. And I like revealing exposition through dialogue. That's always a great choice, but there is a line, right? And you can overdo it sometimes. And so that's why a lot of writers typically are going to balance exposition between dialogue and interiority and narrativizing. The problem is that you said that you wanted this to be omniscient, right? And again, that's always something that I really struggle. People don't like omniscient third person. It typically rubs people the wrong way. And that's just sort of a reality of publishing these days. I share that disdain quite personally. I like close third quite a bit more, but I'm always willing to give a novel a chance and not just write a novel off because it's not in the tense that I like the most. I think that any tense can work in the hands of a great writer, in my opinion. But all that said, I think that if the rest of your book is not omniscient, that is it. We had a whole episode about switching POV tenses and how that can be really problematic. It can really throw people off, and it's something that you should be really resistant to do unless you have a really great reason. So take that for what you will. But yeah, in terms of the exposition in the dialogue itself, I think that we have so much exposition coming from the mother, not the mothers, all that stuff. Like the mother says, like, oh, the mothers know when it's real. They live on their swords. The mothers are nurturing but harsh. These lines to me, I mean, they feel like info dumps. They don't feel like natural dialogue, like what a mother would really be saying to their child. And if you are going to have all this exposition, I need a better reason for why these kids need to know all of this. Why is their mom telling all of this? Because I didn't really get the importance of the ritual, like the real importance of it and why it matters to these kids as much. I will say, I mean, readers, they don't need everything explained outright. Sometimes you can have that mystery. I think that all this prologue is really doing is giving information. It's not building tension. And tension is what you want in order to sneak the exposition in there without people realizing it and noticing. But yeah, again, subtext, I was saying that before. Trust the reader to infer the meaning and the information through subtext, through imagery, right? Character reactions, things that kind of tell you and also show you what's so dangerous and powerful about these mothers, rather than just having the mom talk about it. I'm trying to, because there's mothers capitalized and then there's the mother character, and I'm trying to make sure I'm being clear about who is talking here. But anyway, okay. And then after that, I'd say the other big issue with this one that I would point out, we have a huge missed opportunity for conflict, right? If turning points are like the lack of a turning point is the biggest egregious offense here, I think the second one would probably be the fact that I just don't have the conflict really fleshed out here. Because we have the moment where the sneeze, right? It sets up, I think, a great opportunity for escalating conflict. But then I think the scene, it sort of opts for a very safe resolution, right? It just, everything kind of resolves itself. And that's why it just, again, it fizzles out. But what if the procession that we're reading here, what if they didn't just see it as an omen, but as a transgression, right? What if the mother was wrong about the meaning of the sneeze? Or what if the elder sister's jealousy caused her to lash out in a way that puts everybody, including the family, right, in danger? I think a ritual scene like this begs for tension and, again, consequences. And I just feel like, yeah, we don't have that here. We don't have that conflict. We don't lean into what these moments, these character moments could be doing to the world around them. Instead, we kind of just pull back and then it just kind of ends. And I'm like, what did we get out of this? I don't know what the rest of the story is supposed to really entail for me as the reader. The last thing I'll point out in this one, I already kind of talked about the prose, but and I think the pacing here, there were moments where I thought the pacing was solid, but there were times when it was a bit sluggish. If I'm being extra harsh, I think that there are a couple of moments in this text where there's too much attention given to the details that don't move the story forward. I do think that the red paste, the silver swords, the smoky incense, like these create nice visuals. I know I talk all the time about how you want the writing to create the picture, the scene, the vividness, but the problem here is they don't build tension. I think that the way you're describing these things is so matter of fact that the prose isn't doing enough to put me in the emotional aspect of the scene. All you're really doing is giving me the visuals of the scene. And that is a big issue for me as a reader, because I'm not going to feel like what's going to happen next. You know what I mean? And so that's going to be the issue. I also think the prose, it really meanders for a lot of this. I don't get the sense of urgency because the prose doesn't match any kind of sense of urgency as a scene, a great scene, I think should. I think you could tighten this up a bit and focus on what is supposed to matter, right? The disruption of the sneeze and everything, the crowd's reaction. These are moments that would paint the ominous presence of the mothers in a way that would make your prologue feel like, okay, now I have a sense for what these mothers are, how they operate, and why they are important to the story moving forward when we go into the next character. But it's almost like if you ended the cold open to The Dark Knight where the Joker is robbing that bank. Imagine if we just ended it with all the bank robbers, they just rob the money and then they leave. You don't have the moment where the Joker betrays everybody and then reveals that they were the Joker the whole time. That's kind of what this prologue is doing. You just have the villain character, in Dark Knight just sort of succeed, if that would be the case. And that wouldn't, where's the conflict tension? You know what I'm saying? So like a prologue needs to kind of from the beginning, middle, and end tell a complete story on its own that you could read as a short story. That is a sign that your prologue is working. Otherwise, it's going to not really do enough to warrant the space, because books are economics and you want all of the space and economics and logistics that you can get from your novel. And if a prologue is just adding filler, it is a gap between you and getting a novel to other people, being thin enough to be on that shelf where people are going to see it and booksellers are going to put it there, all that stuff. So yes, please consider tightening this up and reconsidering its inclusion. I personally don't think you necessarily need it. I think a lot of the stuff that you're trying to paint about the mothers, I think you could just do in your chapter 1. I don't know what your chapter 1 is like, but I just don't get the sense that this is information I absolutely need to know through its own self-contained, not even scene, but kind of mood piece that would be super helpful for you in terms of setting up your story and having the reader hooked and invested. So yes, if I had to bring it down to 5 things based on all that stuff: clarify the genre, clarify the stakes. Specifically, decide whether this is a moment of danger. Is this a moment of revelation? Is this purely character development? I don't think it is, because these characters aren't going to come back, right? And make the stakes crystal clear. And next, create a much stronger turning point. You need to let the sneeze have real consequences. You need to paint whether or not it, does it disrupt the ritual? Does it anger the mothers? Is it bring about some terrible blessing or curse, whatever it is? Third, show, don't tell. I know everybody says it, blah, 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 show, don't tell, we know, but it's important here. You don't have to show everything, but you need to show some things. And in this case, instead of explaining through dialogue the mother's power, you need to use visuals. You need to use sensory clues to reveal their influence and build that tension. Number 4, escalate the conflict. Please escalate the conflict. Use the sibling rivalry. You have it right there. The sibling rivalry can do so much work for you. You can also use the crowd's reaction to build more tension. Really fill out that space of how the crowd reacts and make me, the reader, feel like, ooh, this crowd is turning on them. You know what I mean? There's a lot of things you can do to do that concisely and effectively. And specifically, I would say too, let the older, like when the older sister's question comes up, right? That could spark a genuine threat or a confrontation, something that could really punctuate this prologue / scene. And then lastly, tighten that prose. Cut out some extraneous descriptions if you can. Focus on the action, the reaction, maintain the momentum. I understand, as somebody who loves descriptions, it can be tough to do this, and some of your descriptions are important, so it takes some discernment. However, once you paint the scene, every time you use description to paint the scene, it should tell me, and you can refer to our description episode. I talked a lot about this. It should do more than just tell me what the scene looks like. I need to feel the scene. And the descriptions should create the atmosphere of that emotion you're trying to get across. In this case, I think it's ominous, tense, foreboding, all of that. So your descriptions should match that. Use words that feel a little bit darker. I think that some of the words here, like silver swords, use a way to describe a sword that feels more like that sword's about to cut me. Swords so sharp, if they dropped it, the ground itself might split open. That is a description, literally off the top of my head. That's a description that tells you, like, I hope that sword doesn't come near the characters, right? But instead you just say silver swords, because it's like, oh yeah, it's a sword and it's silver. That doesn't tell me enough. It puts me in the scene, like I see it, but my imagination and my emotion are, in that case, disconnected. And I don't have that strong punch right, that would take this scene way higher, right? So focus on all this stuff. I think that boiled all the way down, this scene to me, it's all set up. It's no payoff. You need the sharper stakes, the stronger conflict, a clearer focus, and after that, I think that you would justify having this prologue. And I think that if, let's say, you do decide to maybe not do this prologue, whatever you decide to do, it's up to you as the writer, and you don't have to listen to all the feedback you get, trust me. But this is advice I think that should apply to all of your scenes. This isn't just a prologue thing. So I wish I could just name this episode "How to Make Your Scenes and Prologues," a little bit better, hopefully. Alas, that is not the case. But okay, so I think that should about cover it. This was an interesting one, and I hope that I know I was being a bit harsher than I usually am. I was a little bit more prescriptive too, but I think for those of you listening, if you've been kind of curious, like, what is it like having a professional editor? If you have a decent editor, and I'm not saying that I'm a great editor or anything, I'm not the most experienced of them. I have been doing this for a long time, but I'd say that I've worked with editors who are so much better and more talented than me, who catch things I would never catch. But that said, I kind of put the editor hat on for this episode. I was a little bit more kind of like drill sergeant, and for that reason, I want you to know that is the difference between an editor and a beta reader. So if you decide one day to hire an editor, to work with an editor for whatever reason, and do that sort of thing, that's a thing that you should be looking for, right? If an editor isn't doing that for you the way that I am, or at least some version of it, because everybody has their own styles, right? I'm not saying that it has to be my way, because my way is my way. It's just how I do things. There are editors who do things different than me, but I mean the spirit, right? Of like really trying to dissect your piece and try to really illustrate and demonstrate for you what needs to be done for it to hit that next level. I think that that's what you should find in an editor, hopefully, right? So, okay. That's enough from me. I have gone on long enough. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Thank you to everybody who has sent us in comments, emails, compliments. We've been getting so many, especially on the YouTube channel. I so much appreciate it. It's so wonderful to see that these videos and podcasts are working for some folks. And I'm definitely trying to learn from this experience myself. I feel like I always am, because it's showing me how to apply my own feedback to my own stuff as well. And so, yeah, if you do like the show, if you haven't already, please consider leaving a review or rating on the podcast app that does that. And of course, if you have your own question for me, or if you're looking for some advice or something that could be on an episode of this very podcast, the easiest way to do that is to send us an email. Barbarians@gmail.com is how you reach out to us. And our producer, Natalia Evans, will hopefully get back to you as soon as possible. We have some more stuff coming up that we want to take care of, looking at maybe booking a guest pretty soon too. We'll see. That would be fun to do if we can find and schedule something. But in the meantime, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.